Orchestrated financial narrative with fresh names, avoiding prior character list entirely. Orchestrated financial narrative with fresh names, avoiding prior character list entirely. The day the bank confirmed the wire wouldn't clear, I also found out my husband had been sleeping with a junior associate at his firm for the better part of a year. 2 phone calls, 11 minutes apart. The first from our business banker, his voice careful the way people get careful right before they tell you something is gone. The second from a number I didn't recognize. A woman who hung up the second I said hello, and then my husband's name lighting up the screen a heartbeat later because of course she'd called the wrong saved contact. I didn't cry. I want you to understand that, because later people would decide I was cold, and maybe I was. But that morning I just sat at our kitchen island with my coffee going lukewarm, and I felt something in my chest click shut, like a door you didn't know was open until the draft stopped. He came home that night and asked for a divorce before he even took his shoes off. He was calm about it. He's always calm when he's already decided something and is just waiting for you to catch up. He said I could have the house, the savings, the cars. He didn't want any of it. He said it like he was being generous, like he was handing me a gift, and the whole time there was this softness around his eyes that I hadn't seen aimed at me in months. He wasn't even cruel. That was the worst part. He was gentle, the way you're gentle with someone you've already left. You can have everything, he said. She isn't after the money. I just want to be with her. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because I knew something he didn't, and the knowing sat in my mouth like a coin. See, I'm the one who built the financial side of his company. Not officially anymore, not since he'd quietly pushed me off the books 8 months earlier and brought in some 26-year-old with a finance certificate and a great laugh. But I knew the bones of that business better than he ever would. I knew where the money was real and where it was theater, and that morning, before the affair, before any of it, I'd already learned that the Series B he'd been bragging about for a year, the round that was supposed to make him a wealthy man, the round he'd structured his entire ego around, was dead. The lead investor had pulled the term sheet. There was a personal guarantee he'd signed against the line of credit, the one I'd begged him not to sign, and it was about to come due with nothing behind it. The house he was so nobly giving me, already paid off in my name clean. The savings, mine, separate. The account I'd kept since before we married because some quiet part of me had always known. Everything he was walking away from was the only thing in our lives that wasn't about to turn into debt. Everything he was keeping, his shares, his title, the glittering future he was running toward, was a corpse that hadn't been told it was dead yet. So I tucked that knowledge away the same way you'd fold a letter you're not ready to send, and I looked at the man I'd loved for 6 years and said, "Okay, I hope you mean it." He flinched like he'd expected a fight and didn't know what to do without one. We filed at the county courthouse 2 days later. There's a mandatory 90-day waiting period in our state before the divorce is final, 90 days where either of you can stop the whole thing with a signature. The clerk told us this in a flat voice while she stamped the petition, and I watched my husband's jaw tighten, watched him calculate, and I understood he was already planning to be standing in this exact spot in 90 days, free. "Don't change your mind," he said to me in the parking lot afterward. He actually said that to me, like I was the one clinging. "I won't," I said. "I know you won't either." He had his phone out before he reached his car, already texting, that soft smile blooming on his face for somebody who wasn't me. I remembered when that smile used to be mine. I couldn't tell you the year it stopped being mine. It hadn't happened all at once. It had happened the way the funding had happened, the way everything ends, quietly, in the margins, while you're busy paying attention to something else. I went home and listed the house on Zillow that afternoon. His business partner called me within the hour. I'll call him Victor, because that's close enough, and because I owe him at least a fake name. He was the only one in that whole circus who ever treated me like a person. "Please tell me this is a joke," Victor said. "You two are the most solid couple I know." "We filed this morning," I told him. He went quiet, and I could hear him doing the thing decent people do, trying to find the version of events where everybody's still okay. He's under a lot of pressure with the round. People do stupid things when they're scared. Give it a month, he'll come to his senses. I almost told him then. About the term sheet, about the guarantee, about the whole house of cards I could see from the inside. But it wasn't my company anymore. They'd made sure of that. So I just said, he won't, Victor, and honestly, it's better this way. And I let him think I was talking about my heart. I had the offer accepted on the house within 9 days. A young couple expecting their first kid decided the second they walked in that it was theirs. When the earnest money hit my account, I felt nothing. Not triumph, not grief, just a kind of clean exhaustion, like setting down something you've been carrying so long your arms forgot they were holding it. I bought a smaller place across town, closer to the firm I was about to join, and I started packing up 6 years of a life into cardboard. The first time I saw the two of them together, I wasn't trying to. Victor had asked me to drop off a hard drive my husband had left in our home office, something with old company files on it, and against my better judgment, I agreed, because I wanted it gone, wanted the last physical thread of him out of my house. I drove to their office downtown, the one with my husband's name on the glass that I'd helped him afford, and Victor walked me back through the floor, and there they were through the conference room window. She was sitting on the edge of the table. He was leaning toward her, and she was laughing, and he was looking at her like she was the only solvent thing in his collapsing world. As I watched, he reached for the cup of coffee she handed him, and his hand jerked, just slightly, and the coffee slopped over the rim onto a stack of papers. He frowned at his own fingers like they betrayed him. She just laughed harder and dabbed at the spill with a napkin, said something I couldn't hear, and he smiled and kissed her knuckles. The stress was already eating him. I could see it even then, the way his weight had dropped, the gray under his eyes, the tremor he kept blinking away like it was nothing. He thought it was nothing. He thought everything that morning was nothing. I handed Victor the hard drive and turned to go, and that's when my husband saw me. His face went through about 4 things at once and landed on something ugly and certain. "Couldn't stay away," he said, loud enough for her to hear, that smirk twisting his mouth. "I figured you'd find an excuse." The woman, Bianca, her name was Bianca, looked up at me with this bright, victorious little smile, like she'd won something off a shelf. "I came to return your hard drive," I said. "Victor asked me to. Congratulations on the conference room." And I left, and I made it all the way to the elevator before my hands started shaking, and I stood in that little steel box writing down 12 floors, thinking about how I used to be the one he leaned toward across the table. I want to be honest about the part that comes next, because this is where people in the comments would later get loud, would later decide what kind of woman I was. His parents wanted to have dinner. He showed up at the house I was packing up, stood in the doorway without coming in, and told me his mother had set a place for me Sunday, and I was expected. We hadn't told his family anything yet. He still wanted me there, performing, smoothing it over, the way I'd always smoothed everything over for 6 years. "They're your parents," I said. "Not mine. Not for much longer." "We haven't signed the final papers," he snapped. "Don't be cruel to them." Cruel. He stood in the doorway of the home I was selling because he'd blown it up, and he called me cruel. I went to the dinner. I don't fully know why. Some last reflex of the wife I used to be. His mother loaded my plate. His father asked, the way he'd asked at every dinner for 3 years, when I was going to slow down at the firm and give them a grandchild, when I was going to stop being so career-focused, like my work was a phase I'd grow out of. I'd always nodded and smiled and changed the subject. That night I set down my fork. "I think you should save that speech," I said, "for whoever he marries next." The table went silent. So I told them, all of it, that their son had been cheating on me with a girl from his office for the better part of a year, that he'd asked for the divorce, that he'd insisted, generously, that he wanted to leave the marriage with nothing. My husband went the color of paper. His father turned to him slow and asked if it was true, and after a long moment my husband lifted his chin and said, "Her name is Bianca. She's wonderful. I'd like to bring her to meet you." Just like that, like he was announcing good news. His father stood up so fast his chair scraped. There was a lot of yelling about appearances, about the family name, about what people would say, and almost none of it was about me. And Dak told me everything I needed to know about where my husband had learned to think a marriage was a thing you manage for the optics. At one point, his father turned to me with this oily, recalculating warmth and suggested we just quietly withdraw the petition, smooth it over, no need to embarrass anyone. His mother grabbed my hand and promised they'd stop pushing about the baby if I'd just be reasonable. I pulled my hand back. I'm not generous enough, I said, to take back a husband whose heart is already in someone else's apartment. That's when his mother's voice curdled. Well, she said, he may have strayed, but you have to ask yourself what you did to push him there. A man doesn't wander from a wife who keeps him happy. I laughed. I couldn't help it. It came out small and cold. He's the one who cheated, I said. I'm not going to carry that for him too. And I picked up my purse and walked out into the cold. He caught me on the front walk, reached for my arm, and his hand froze in the air between us, trembling, that same tremor I'd seen in the conference room. He saw me see it, and he yanked his hand back like I'd burned him. Did you do that on purpose? He hissed. Tell them like that, now they never accept her. I looked at him for a long moment. I genuinely could not remember, standing there, why I'd ever loved him. The man in my memory had been tender. This one looked at me like I was an obstacle. When you decided to do this, I asked him, did you ever think about tonight? His face went rigid. I drove home. For a couple of weeks after that, life got quiet. I blocked his family, kept only his number for the day we'd have to finalize things, and I let myself believe we were done. We weren't. He landed in the ER of the hospital where my best friend's husband worked. Not mine, I should say. I'm not a doctor. I just have a lot of people in my orbit, and Naomi's husband texted her and Naomi texted me because she's the kind of friend who tells you things. Stress, ulcer, bleeding. My husband had been living on coffee and panic for months, and his body had finally filed its own complaint. Bianca was there. According to Naomi's husband, she spent the whole night on her phone in the waiting room and asked twice when she could go home. The next morning, she showed up with a giant spicy breakfast burrito for a man who just had a stomach scoped. Because she didn't know that you don't. Because nobody had ever taught her to take care of anyone. Because that had never been the point of her. He'd left me, the woman who used to leave him soup in the fridge with reheating instructions written on the sticky note, for someone who brought him a burrito the morning after a GI bleed. I didn't go see him. I want to be clear about that, because later somebody would write, as his wife, she should have at least checked on him, and the answer is no. I wasn't his wife. He'd made very sure of that. I sent nothing, said nothing, did nothing, and the silence felt less like cruelty than like finally setting down a weight. The thing that nearly broke me came 2 weeks later, in a parking garage of all places, after we'd both been at the same downtown building for unrelated reasons. Me signing my employment paperwork at the new firm, him meeting with what was left of his investors. He caught me by my car. He looked terrible. Thin, gray, leaning a little on the car beside mine like standing took effort. I need to ask you something, he said, and I need you to be honest. He took a breath. Last winter, when you said you were at that off-site in Charlotte for 4 days, were you actually with someone? I stared at him. What? There's a photo, he said, and his voice cracked, and for 1 second he sounded like the man I'd married. You and some guy, going into a hotel. Late, Bianca found it months ago. She told me not to confront you, that you'd just deny it. That's part of why I... He stopped, glowed. And the whole rotten foundation of the last year shifted under my feet, because I finally understood. He'd thought I cheated first. He'd built the entire story he told himself. She pulled away, she's cold, she's gone, so I'm allowed on a photo and a girlfriend's whisper. That winter, the 4 days in Charlotte, I'd flown out to quietly meet with a forensic accountant and an attorney because I'd already seen the cracks in his company's books, the round-tripping, the revenue that kept getting recognized twice, the personal guarantee he kept brushing off. I went to protect us. The man in the photo was the attorney. The hotel was where the meetings were. Because that's where you have those meetings, in a conference room off a hotel lobby with a pot of bad coffee. I'd come home from that trip terrified for our future, and tried to tell him, and he'd waved me off, exhausted, said he didn't have the bandwidth for my doom and gloom, and I'd swallowed it, and assumed he was just stressed. He'd thought I was having an affair, and instead of asking me, instead of saying a single word, he'd let it rot. Let Bianca pour herself into the crack. Let himself decide I was the one who'd betrayed us first, so that everything he did after wouldn't count. I pulled out my phone, found the news write-up about the fraud case that attorney had eventually helped expose at a different company, the one with both our names and the same byline because I'd been a quoted source, dated and time-stamped to that exact week in Charlotte. I held it up to him. "That's the trip," I said. "That's the man. We were trying to figure out how to keep your company from going under. I came home and tried to tell you, and you said you didn't have the bandwidth." I watched it land, watched the color drain out of him, watched him understand that he burned down a marriage over a photo he never bothered to ask about. "If you suspected me," I said, my voice very quiet, "why didn't you just ask?" He had no answer. There isn't one. "The only person who betrayed this marriage," I said, "is you." And I got in my car. I thought that would be the last hard conversation. It wasn't. He started calling at night, drunk, that loose, slurry voice I knew from years of post-client dinner phone calls. By day, he was still parading her around. Naomi told me he'd taken Bianca ring shopping, before our divorce was even final. By night he'd call me, and the mask would come off. "You sold the house," he said on one of those calls. "It's my house. It was always my house. What I do with it is none of your business." A long silence. Then, "Where are you living now? I want to see you." "There's no need. We'll see each other when we sign." "I think I made a mistake," he blurted, and the words tumbled out of him in a rush, and I held the phone away from my ear for a second, because I genuinely couldn't tell if I wanted to laugh or scream. "Bianca and I, she doesn't take care of anything. She can't cook, the apartment's a disaster. I asked her for a glass of water and a pill when my stomach was acting up, and she told me she's not my maid. She's jealous of everything. I had a dinner with a female investor, and she lost her mind. Made a scene. I lost the deal. She threatened to do something to herself, and I spent 3 hours talking her down. I'm so tired I didn't know how good I had it with you." I dug my nails into my palm. "You knew what I was like when you married me," I said. "Demanding career. Long hours. You said it was what you loved about me." "I thought I wanted equal," he said, and his voice went raw. "Turns out I wanted someone who looked up to me, who needed me. You never needed me." That one I let sit. Because it was true, and because it was the saddest thing he'd ever said, and because it explained everything. He hadn't left me for a younger woman. He'd left me for the feeling of being looked up to, and he was about to find out exactly what that feeling was worth when the money was gone. "You're drunk," I told him. "I'm not. I regret it. Every day. Can we not do this? The divorce?" "In 3 weeks," I said. "You'll be free to be with the woman you love. I'm not going to stand in your way." And I hung up, and I sat in the dark of my half-unpacked apartment, and I let myself cry exactly once, all the way through, the way you'd lance something. And then I was done. The night before we finalized, my best friend had a birthday dinner. Naomi had been overseas and hadn't gotten the full story. And in some catastrophe of group text logistics, she'd invited both of us, not realizing. And so I walked in, and there he was. And the table of mutual friends who also didn't know greeted us like the golden couple we'd been pretending to be for years. They seated us next to each other out of habit. Halfway through, he tried to put a piece of bread on my plate. Old reflex, the kind of small tending that used to mean something, and his hand seized up and the bread tumbled and his fork clattered against the china. Everyone laughed warmly. "Still so in love after 6 years?" somebody teased. "What's your secret you two never fight?" I reached over and steadied his hand before I could think about it, the way you'd help anyone, and he looked at me with such naked grief that I had to look away. Then his phone lit up with her name, and the whole table cooed about who Bianca was, and he went the color of the tablecloth, and excused himself to take it. And through the window, I could see him on the sidewalk, getting torn apart by a voice on the other end. When he came back, pale and shaking, he made some excuse and grabbed his coat, and just as he reached the door, I said, clear enough for the whole table to hear, "Don't forget, 9 a.m. the courthouse." The room went still. He froze in the doorway. After a long moment he said, "Right," and then he was gone. And everyone finally understood, and the pity in the room was its own kind of awful. I left early. He showed up the next morning looking like he hadn't slept in a week. We sat on a bench in the hallway, waiting for our number. Two people who'd shared a bed for 6 years, sitting like strangers at a bus stop. When they called us up, he didn't move for a second. "Do we really have to do this?" he said. I didn't turn around. "You made this decision the day you decided not to ask me about that photo," I said, and I walked to the window. He had to sign last. His hand trembled so badly he dropped his pen. Then his ID and I bent and picked them up off the counter and handed them back without looking at him, and I watched the panic flash across his face. Not panic about the divorce, panic about the hand, about a body that was slipping out of his control under the weight of stress he didn't understand yet. The clerk asked if both parties wished to proceed. I said yes, clear and steady. He took a long time. Then he said yes too, barely above a whisper. She slid 2 copies across the counter. I picked mine up and felt nothing but a deep, oceanic calm. He followed me out into the bright, cold afternoon. "Did you really sell the house?" he asked. I turned and looked at him, really looked, at how much smaller he'd gotten in a month. "Yes," I said. "Why? Did your girlfriend already tell you how far short she is on the down payment for that condo she wants?" His face went white. How do you know that?" "It doesn't matter how," I said. "What matters is that you should understand by now what she's actually after." And right on cue, a car pulled up and Bianca climbed out, took one look at us standing together, and wedged herself between us with her hand wrapped around his arm like a claim. She inspected the divorce decree he silently handed her, and her whole face lit up. "Finally," she said, "now it's real." She turned to me, glowing with this awful satisfaction. "Thanks for making it happen." I looked at her young, calculating face, and the strangest thing happened. I didn't hate her. I pitied her, because she had no idea what she'd actually won. A man whose fortune was about to turn into a liability, whose company was already a held breath, whose body was already starting to send up flares. "You're welcome," I said. "I hope you'll both be very happy." And I got in my car and drove away, and in the rear view I saw him watching me go while she chattered at his shoulder, and the look on his face was pure regret, and it did not move me at all. The company folded 11 weeks later. I heard it in pieces, from Naomi, from Victor, who called me one night just to talk, sounding hollowed out. The personal guarantee came due. The investors who'd promised the round vanished the way investors do. There was a clawback, a forensic audit, a whisper of fraud that I knew wasn't a whisper. And my ex-husband, who'd walked away from a paid-off house and a clean savings account so he could keep his glorious equity, watched that equity become a stack of debt with his signature on the bottom. He sold the cars. He sold the watch he'd bought himself the year the company made it. And somewhere in there, Bianca took the engagement ring he'd put on a credit card and the contents of their joint account and stopped returning his calls. I'd be lying if I told you I felt nothing. I felt a kind of quiet, terrible vindication, the sort you don't say out loud because it makes you sound like exactly the cold woman everyone decided you were. "No one deserves to lose everything," somebody would say. And they'd be right, and I'd still feel what I felt. There was a tremor, too. The thing with his hands. By the time the dust settled, he'd seen a neurologist, and the news wasn't good, and the stress hadn't caused it, but it sure hadn't helped. And a part of me, the part that used to leave him soup with reheating instructions, ached for one long night about that. And then I let it go, because here is the thing I came to understand. I am not anyone's consolation prize, and I am not anyone's nurse. And the day a man decides you're disposable is the day he forfeits his claim on your softness. You can love someone all the way and still not owe them your whole life when they've handed it back. A year later, I made partner at the firm, the youngest they'd ever named, on the strength of the same forensic instincts my ex-husband used to call doom and gloom. There was a dinner. An award, a little crystal thing I keep on a shelf where I can see it, and as I was leaving the building afterward, I saw him in the lobby, leaning on a cane, so thin his suit hung off him like a coat on a hook. We'd both been invited to the same industry event. The world is small that way. He asked for 5 minutes. I gave him a bench in the building's little courtyard. "I figured it out," he said. "The Charlotte trip. The guarantee. You knew the round was dead before I did. You knew everything was going to collapse." He looked at me, and his eyes were wet. "The day I asked for the divorce, you already knew, didn't you, that if I walked away with nothing, Nothing was the only safe thing to have. Yes, I said. Then why didn't you tell me? His voice broke. You could have stopped me. You could have saved me from all of it. And I sat there in the cooling evening and I gave him the truest answer I had. Because by then you weren't mine to save, I said. You'd already pushed me off the books, out of the marriage, out of your trust. The day you decided I was the enemy, I stopped being the person who protects you. That's not cruelty. That's just what you built. He bowed his head. I deserve this, he said. I deserve all of it. I didn't argue. I'd stopped needing him to be wrong. If I hadn't, he started and stopped and tried again. If I'd just asked you about the photo, if I'd listened, would you have stayed through everything? The money? This? He gestured vaguely at the cane, the wreckage of himself. I thought about it honestly, because he deserved an honest answer even if he deserved nothing else. Yes, I said, if you'd been worth staying for, I would have stayed until the very end. I'd have learned to give you the shots myself. His face crumpled. But there are no ifs, I said, standing. You made your choices. You don't get to grieve the version of me that would have stayed. That woman was real and you sent her away. I left him there on the bench in the last of the light, and I felt, walking out, lighter than I'd felt in years. I'm telling you all of this from 30,000 feet actually, because that's where I am right now, on a plane to a fellowship in another city. A new chapter I applied for on a whim and got. The man in the seat beside me is the attorney from Charlotte, the one in the photo, the one my ex spent a marriage being jealous of for no reason at all. We ran into each other in the terminal and laughed about the absurdity of it, and somewhere over the middle of the country, he told me, a little nervously, that he'd admired me for years and would I ever consider letting him take me to dinner when we landed? I looked out at the clouds for a while before I answered. I thought about how long I'd spent being looked through, being managed, being the one who tended and protected and got handed back like something a man had outgrown. And I thought about how the future was the one thing my ex-husband couldn't take with him into the ruin he'd chosen, because I'd kept it the same way I'd kept that little separate account, quietly, for myself, just in case. We can start as friends, I said, and he smiled and the plane carried us forward into all that open sky. For a long time after the divorce was final, I kept turning one question over in my head. Could I have stopped it? The honest answer is no, and not because I lacked the information, but because the moment my husband decided I was the enemy, I lost the standing to protect him. He pushed me off the books. He believed a photo over 6 years of marriage. He let Bianca whisper a story into the crack instead of asking me a single direct question. Every collapse that came after, the dead funding round, the personal guarantee, the company folding, grew out of choices he made with his own hands while I stood right there, ready to help, watching him decide he didn't need me. What I learned is that the cleanest revenge isn't a scheme. It's simply refusing to lie. I never sabotaged him. I never hid a number that was mine to share. I let him keep exactly what he insisted on keeping, and I kept what was always lawfully mine, and the difference between ruin and safety turned out to be nothing more than the truth I'd quietly seen months before he did. Doing the right thing, even when no one's watching and no one would blame you for less, is its own kind of armor. It meant that when everything came apart, I had nothing to be ashamed of and nothing to take back. But character alone wouldn't have saved me. I had to be sharp, too. The reason I came out whole is that I'd been paying attention when it was inconvenient to pay attention. Reading the cap table, flying to Charlotte, keeping a separate account I'd opened years before I had any reason to. People called it cold. I call it seeing clearly. Loving someone never required me to switch off my judgment. And the day I stopped letting my husband talk me out of what I could plainly see was the day I started protecting my own future. And then there was the part nobody claps for, the slow, unglamorous strength it takes to sit at that courthouse, to walk out of that family dinner, to cry exactly once, and then get up the next morning and rebuild. Bianca thought she'd won something. Victor kept hoping we'd patch it up. I just kept putting one foot in front of the other, packing boxes, signing paperwork, showing up at the new firm, until one day I looked up and the life I'd built without him was steadier than the one I'd lost. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Guard your integrity, because it's the one thing no betrayal can repossess. Keep your eyes open, especially toward the people you love most. And when the floor falls out, survive the night and build again. The future is the one thing they can never make you hand over.